Aggie is a translator, but the two of you have, you are a poet and translator, and you had a poet to translate your poems as well. And do you think it matters? I mean, is it important to have a poet to translate? Laima, how about you?
Yes, I think it definitely matters, because as we were talking before, when a poet translates the work of another poet, indeed, what happens is a conversation between two poets, a literary conversation. Also, it's important for a poet to translate the work of other poets because a poet really has internalized the craft of poetry, rhythm, rhyme, form, and unless a translator is maybe an avid reader of poetry, it's really hard unless you're working with the craft and struggling with the craft of poetry to be able to then manipulate prosody at the same time that you're trying to preserve metaphor from one very different language into another, and to really hold on to the story of the poem.
And how much freedom? How much freedom do you give Judith Wilkinson, for instance, in translating them? And are they the same length? I mean, you've got Cloud 9 and 710 and so on.
Yes.
These are very English phrases.
Yes. Yeah, I give her complete freedom to translate, but in a way, she sends her translation to me, and then I comment on it. Of course, that can only be in English, maybe a bit in German and French, but not in other languages, which I don't know. But we discuss a lot the translations, and quite often, because she's a poet, that's true. She comes up with a solution which is better than the Dutch, better than what I have written. So I'm almost jealous of her.
Are you jealous of yourself, Aggie? I mean, you're in the most extraordinary position, really.
Yes, it's quite hard to follow myself. The most
As long as
recent,
you're not critical of yourself.
the most recent bizarre thing that happened to me, that a Hungarian literary journal, I had been publishing Hungarian poems for the last 10 years, found me again and asked for a Hungarian poem. I haven't written a Hungarian poem for about 3-4 years, so what I had to do is actually translate my English poem into my mother tongue, which I wrote originally in English, and it was very emotional and just bizarre.
Another thing that struck me about just having the three of you together is that the Lithuanian and the Hungarian, to sort of brand it in that way, you could definitely feel the country in each of those your readings. Whereas with yours, Toons, I mean, there was no particular Dutchness about it at all. It was very universal subject. I mean, do you feel that for both of you? I mean, do you feel that the national identity, to give it that rather grand phrase, actually runs through what you do in some way?
I think that particularly in these poems that were originally written in 1977, you have to understand they were written at a time when Lithuanians were suffering from a loss of their homelands, whether they found themselves in places of exile in Siberia or Tajikistan or Kazakhstan, or whether they ended up in the West as emigres, or whether they're Lithuanians living on their own soil, like in the poem where Kukutis is living on his own land and he just desires to see his homeland. That there was really a sense of mourning and loss of identity and nationhood, and those emotions were very strong, and they really come through in the poetry. More contemporary poetry being written now, 20 plus years after independence, there's less of that.
But it's still there, isn't it? I mean, from some of the more recent Lithuanian poetry in English I've been hearing in the last few years, it's still quite, strongly nationalistic, if you like, or not. I don't mean that in a negative way at all. What do you feel, Aggie? I mean,
my poetry is not nationalistic.
No, not national. But as far as, I mean, when your national identity is the phrase, really.
Well, that's just inevitable, really.
But do you feel there's something, I mean, obviously you're Hungarian, and
I think there's something about small nations, such as Lithuania,
You know, it's interesting that we should actually, we're more, I suppose British are more similar to the Dutch in the sense that we sort of try to conquer everything and live by the sea, I suppose, and there's much more as well. But in that sense, a more open internationalism, if you like. But we still don't know much Dutch literature, do we? Or let alone Dutch poetry. And I think it's quite extraordinary that we in Britain know so little of what you write. Do you get upset by that?
A lot of poets get upset by it. I don't get upset by it because the thing, we read a lot of English literature, of course, but the thing is, well, that's one thing about England and English language is, for instance, my children's books have been translated in 19 languages, including Estonian, Croatian, and some other languages before the first one was translated in English. Because my publisher said, the English always say, we have everything, we have all the books there, we don't need anything from abroad. So that's, you don't read much Dutch literature, but in Germany, for instance, they read a lot of Dutch literature, and in France too, and in other countries, but not in England.
That basically sums us up, isn't it?
Yes.
Unfortunately, we're trying to expose ourselves to it a little bit more. But I mean, this idea, and we called this evening European Poetry Night. The idea of there being, you know, European poetry or European fiction. Obviously, we're using this as an umbrella term, but do you think there's such a thing as, you know, European fiction, poetry, literature today?
I don't know. I wouldn't know what to answer to that question. European.
How about the idea of an international? I mean, this idea of, some people get very upset about this idea that the more we translate into English as a dominant language, the more it all sounds the same. And you know that national languages, if you like, your original languages can fall victim to this as a kind of international sounding poetry or fiction. Not something you've thought about either. But it's I mean, do you feel angry that that English is so dominant? I mean, does it?
No, I don't feel
no?
angry.
No. Wait, would you like more to be translated into English?
Yes.
Or
I
you
like to
quite-
write more poetry. I don't. Well, it's of course I'm very proud and happy that poetry is translated in English. But for instance, as you said, it's years later, and those poets, the poetry that it's translated is usually I'm not so much interested in anymore.